Like every teenager, I'm a big fan of paradoxes. One I've been thinking about a lot recently, being in my AP government class, is Karl Popper's paradox of tolerance. It introduces a somewhat convoluted idea of tolerance and leads to many more questions about our ever-changing political system. So what is it exactly, and what makes it so controversial? Austrian-born philosopher Karl Popper is regarded as one of the most important philosophers of the 20th century. While his most important contribution is to falsification and the ability to prove or disprove scientific facts, what concerns us most today is in his 1945 book, The Open Society and Its Enemies. His idea is, in order to maintain a tolerant society, the society must be intolerant of intolerance. If a so-called tolerant society permits the existence of intolerant philosophies, it is no longer tolerant. Here arises the direct paradox. In order to be a tolerant group, you must be intolerant of some groups. Let's take the example he was most concerned about, the Nazis, since his book was written in 1945. If we were tolerant of all groups and ideas, that would require us to be tolerant of the ideas of the Nazis. But since the Nazis are perpetrators of genocide, they are inherently intolerant, and in order to have a tolerant society, we can't tolerate systemic genocide. This paradox is used mainly in three different applications. One in politics, business, and education, and I will be talking about the paradox in each context. In liberal democracies, we preach the idea of toleration. We listen to other people's ideas, even if we don't agree. This is the whole idea of the First Amendment. However, this idea can be problematic. For example, we support the ACLU, aka the American Civil Liberties Union, whose goal is to preserve individual rights and liberties, until they defend the rights of KKK members. Likewise, we promote productive political discourse and competition until an intolerant party obtains power. People who support Popper's paradox often support the idea of a defensive democracy. A defensive democracy is the ability of the government to limit certain powers and freedoms in order to protect the self-preservation of the country. This on the surface makes sense. After all, the Nazis, a notoriously anti-democratic party, took over legally. Examples of modern-day defensive democratic policies would be banning Holocaust now or even banning some parties from running, which has happened in Germany and Israel with the extremist Kach party. We obviously don't want groups in politics who want to destroy democracy, but we also don't want the arbitrary process of governments barring political and rival parties from running. This counter-argument rarely occurs in modern-day democracies though. More often than not, public information campaigns are run instead of the banning of rival political parties. The toleration idea becomes more interesting when you consider corporations versus the government. One case that stuck out to me was the 2019 ruling by the San Antonio City Council, which barred a Chick-fil-A from opening in the airport. They cited that the restaurant donated to groups with anti-LGBTQ rhetoric, such as the Salvation Army. Using Karl Popper's reasoning, San Antonio won't tolerate Chick-fil-A because Chick-fil-A was intolerant. However, this seems to be an overuse of the intended concepts. If you go to Popper's actual quote from the book, we see that he says that the tolerant society should attempt to have a rational argument. However, this might not work because, quote, they may forbid their followers to listen to rational arguments because it is deceptive and teach them to answer arguments by the use of their fists and pistols. Basically, the concern is that these intolerant groups would use violence and, quote, kill the tolerant society. Going back to the Nazis, that meant genocide. In a modern-day application, we would extend that to all violence. But how does Chick-fil-A being served in an airport lead to violence? Chick-fil-A didn't go after LGBTQ activists and threaten violence of minority groups. The argument is that they made people feel uncomfortable. Now, philosopher Michael Walzer, in his book, quote, On Toleration, extended this physical violence Popper talked about to psychological violence. But this leads to more of a debate on morality and partisanship, rather than actual violence or destruction of democratic institutions. This overuse of the tolerance paradox is even more prevalent in regards to the spreading of information on college campuses. Over the years, more and more university students have attempted to stop guest speakers from speaking. Georgetown students protested when Ben Shapiro was going to speak on campus. This also applies to university faculty. UCI students protested Professor of Psychology Elizabeth Loftus when she presented her controversial work on memory and public trial bias. However, not allowing people such as Ben Shapiro to speak wouldn't stop major intolerance, as Ben Shapiro doesn't promote violent, intolerant ideas. One can certainly argue that Ben Shapiro's conservative ideas make people uncomfortable. However, with such political polarization in modern society, it is inevitable that ideas will make people uncomfortable. Being uncomfortable overextends Popper's idea of being intolerant of intolerance. If college students believe that Shapiro's ideas are detrimental, they can choose not to go to his speech or debate his ideas and find flaws in his reasoning. Finding this exact line will continue to get more and more difficult. We don't want to suppress ideas that don't fit with liberal campus populations and bar them from being discussed. Furthermore, hate speech, especially on social media, is growing. However, where to separate hate speech from political partisanship can be difficult. And finally, in politics, debate and the expression of all groups is important, but we don't want another January 6th, or something worse.